Hi, this is Ryan at Cincy Life Community News. It's July 13th, 2015, and this came out today. I was interested in the topic of Klonopin because my family has a history of using this, at least my brother does. But my family has other prescriptions, that they've used for years that are either similar or have similar effects as Klonopin. But my brother has been on this for 13 years, and it just makes me think that he could have had a whole different life had he not been on this drug. And it's terrible. I see the effects. I see him, my other brother died. Well, we have a long history, so I can kind of get into that and just explain my history and why this is interesting to me. But when I was 17 years old, my parents thought that to fix my problems, they'd get me on some drugs. My problems had a lot to do with my dad's drinking. He had an alcohol abuse issue for a good portion of my life as a teenager for, I guess, 3/4 of my young adult life. From, the day I was born all the way until I was about 13 years old, my dad had problems with drinking. We moved around a lot. We had a lot of family strife. My parents separated. I went to live with my grandma. My parents moved me back in with them by force. They had to get me into a inpatient rehab and lie to them and say that I was on drugs. And then when I was in this inpatient program when I was 13, I wasn't using drugs at the time. In fact, I was listening to like Minor Threat. They were my favorite band. They were straight edge. They were against drugs. They were against drinking. They were against smoking. They were against sex, without marriage. Minor Threat was like, a very big influence in my life, and I was very against drugs. But they put me in this inpatient rehab facility where I met drug connections and people who were into drugs, and then they prescribed me drugs, and they got me on Tegretol. And Tegretol is bad news. It's like a tranquilizer. It's actually deemed as an anticonvulsant. But they said that because I had violence, that's why they put me on it. But when I lived with my grandma, for the 2 years that I lived with her after my parents split up, there was no violence in my life. But when they moved me back in with them, we had violence, and a lot of it had to do with me and my father's, troubled relationship. After I moved out of home, I never had that problem. I have no history of violence on my, criminal record, and, my wife and I have never had violence domestically, between us, nothing like that. Just when I lived at home, and it was, for a very short time of my life. But they put me on that Tegretol stuff, and by the time I was 17, I was on Zoloft. I had gotten off the Tegretol, they put me on Zoloft, and I tried to kill myself at age 17. I got my stomach pumped. They let me out of the hospital. I fled. I jumped on a bus and went to Seattle, and I was done with just dealing with the family issues that I was on, on medication for. After I left home and went to Washington, I did fine. I met a new family. They kind of adopted me, my grandma Penny. I still have a relationship with her. I've had a relationship with her for about 20 years. Never had any problems there, and it's just been a pretty good overall life that I've had since I left my parents' house. But when I was 21, I went back to school and lived with my parents for a short time while I was going to school. And I was an adult at this time. I was 21. I was working for Microsoft at the time, and actually no, at that time I was working for Dentrix Dental Systems. I had just worked for Microsoft, and I was about to transition back into a job for MSN, and I was working for Dentrix Dental Systems. But my youngest brother was on Zoloft, again, another episode of Zoloft in our family. And my mom had been taking Wellbutrin and other things, Prozac for most of her life, and other things like Zoloft. So, she thought that was an easy answer to the problems that we were having. So she got my brother on Zoloft after I'd already tried to kill myself, and I was taking Zoloft to do it. I actually overdosed on it. And so it was amazing to me that they would go back to something that almost killed me for my brother's symptoms. And so he ended up taking too many and killing himself. And they told me for a long time it was an accident. It was not. It was suicide. I I actually ordered the death certificate in the police report, and there was a lot more to it than they let on. It was suicide. It was intentional, and it had everything to do with those drugs. He was fine before he started taking the drugs. He got on the drugs. 6 weeks later, he was dead. So it was obviously because of the drugs. Well, after he died, the day that he died, my mom noticed that my brother was dealing with the pain and the loss, and my brother that was in between my youngest and me my brother Brad ended up on Klonopin the day that my youngest brother died. They went and got him an anti-anxiety pill. And that was 13 years ago, and as far as I understand it, he's still using these. And it's a very difficult drug to get off of. And, I see the same effects that what is talked about with Stevie Nicks. She's from oh gosh, why am I not thinking of the band now? Anyway, Fleetwood Mac, yes. But for 8 years of her life, she says that Klonopin destroyed her life for those 8 years. She couldn't function. She was totally out of her mind. She wasn't functioning like a normal human being. And I see that kind of, with my brother. My brother, before the Klonopin, had girlfriends, had a job, had a normal life, had a social life, had friends, had, interactions with people on a regular basis, daily almost. Always was very smart. And then after the Klonopin, he changed, and he's very reclusive, doesn't have a girlfriend, doesn't work, claims to be disabled, has gotten approved for disability, but I think the disability came from the drugs, because he was fine before the drugs. Then after the drugs, he's gone into this haze, and it's like, with these interventions, what do you do with these things? If someone's gone and their life is destroyed, and they have a chance, they could possibly turn it around, but for 13 years they haven't. What do you do to reach out? Especially when, I'm the horrible bad guy or whatever. And I've always been that way ever since I was like 8 years old in this family. That's why I always tried to move out. That's why I lived with my grandma for several years. That's why I moved out at age 17 and went and lived on the streets in Seattle. That's why I always tried to stay away from them, because there was always some sort of a contention, and I was always the bad guy. But to reach out to him, how do I do that? I wrote him tonight after I read this article, and I said, dude, I know we have problems. I don't know what it is. I guess I'm the bad guy again. We haven't talked in years. Listen, I think this is possibly why. This has got to be something to do with it. This Klonopin is bad news. But what she had revealed in this is just amazing. And this article from Health Impact News, I'm going to link this at the bottom. You really should read this. But it's just terrible. I hate to see parents prescribe their kids medicine to fix simple teenage issues. These things all resulted from when we were teenagers. My sister was put into inpatient rehab when she was 16 or 16, I believe. She was locked up for a month. I was locked up for a month when I was 13. My brother Brad was prescribed this horrible Klonopin, and then my youngest brother died off an overdose from the drugs that he was prescribed. And all these things that we were dealing with were simple teenage issues. I mean, yeah, we had a violent home, and maybe, they say I was so violent, I was so horrible. Heck, when I left their house, anytime I could get away, there wasn't that violence issue. I didn't have that issue. But when I went home, apparently I was always a violent guy. So it had to have been something with that situation, because I'm not that way outside of their home. But so there was that, and there was other issues with school. But as far as just normal teenage things, I think that parents, and my parents in particular, but parents in kids' lives that I've grown up with in Utah, especially, Utah is notorious for being the #1 abusive state for drugs, or the #1 state in the nation for drug abuse. For all kinds of drug abuse, for SSRI drugs, for opiates, for, anything you can think of in prescriptions, they are #1. They double they double the national average. They triple the usage rates in New York, and they triple the usage rates of LA in Salt Lake City. So it is an issue in Utah. But it was something that I grew up with, and it was very, much a part of my life. So when I read something like this, it deeply affects me. I was diagnosed with PTSD after my accident. I got in a head-on collision. The guy that hit me, the drunk driver that hit me, died. And I had very horrible issues. I still have them. I still have an issue with dealing with stress. I have a low tolerance for stress, lower than before. I've always dealt with stress very well, living on the streets, working in tech support, 96 hours a week. I've always been able to deal with stress well. After the accident, I've had a hard time with it. And after they diagnosed me with this PTSD, they offered me some anti-anxiety medication, and I absolutely said no. I rejected it immediately. and I used cannabis instead, which is something I've always used, in place of these prescription drugs ever since I was a teenager. Ever since I got turned on to the drugs after my parents put me in the inpatient rehab, the drug that I would go to was this marijuana, and it's always helped me with my stress and my anxiety, way better than any of the drugs my parents had me on. And I wish that marijuana was legal for that kind of thing all over the world, because it's such a valuable asset, and it's an herb. It's not a drug. It's less addictive than chocolate. It's less addictive than caffeine. Nobody has ever overdosed from it, and yet it's illegal. It doesn't even, I can't even believe it. But if you look at these statistics, you see, like many of you, I'm sure, I enjoyed listening to Fleetwood Mac in the 70s and was quite surprised to read Stevie Nicks' story. It's been repeatedly demonstrated that prescription drugs can and frequently do pose serious risk to your health. In this case, Fleetwood Mac star Stevie Nicks ended up battling the devastating side effects of the drug she probably didn't need in the first place, and it swallowed 8 years of her life. Although many fail to realize this, prescription drugs can be just as addictive as illegal drugs. In fact, in many cases, there is no difference between a street drug and a prescription drug. For example, hydrocodone, a prescription opiate, is a synthetic heroin. It's indistinguishable from any other heroin as far as your brain and body is concerned. So if you're hooked on hydrocodone, you are in fact a good old-fashioned heroin addict. Unfortunately, not a lot of attention is paid to prescription drug abuse. Still, nearly 20% of Americans admit to having used prescription drugs for non-medical reasons, and 3/4 of those may be abusing prescription drugs. And then you look at the statistics. I mean, it's just overwhelming. According to later Kaiser statistics from the Kaiser Health Foundation, the average American aged 19 to 64 now takes more than 11 prescription drugs. I mean, that's just crazy. We're way overprescribed. And you look at the deaths, the death rates, the overdose rates. I mean, prescription drugs are right up there next to the illegal drugs with all of the prescription overdoses and, cause of harm in society. And I've made videos of this in the past. I'll have to show you those. But what was interesting tonight, and I'm going to show you this, but I'm going to cover up the name of the person who wrote it. But after I posted this about Stevie Nicks with the Klonopin, this friend of my brother's, he said, this is just for people who can't take responsibility for their own actions and blame it on a prescription drug that's not really that big of a deal. Take some responsibility, people, for the stupid things you do, and don't blame them on the things that you take. That's why I did this. That's just stupid. And, if I go over to his site or his page, I'm going to have to cover this up because his name and, other people's names are involved in this. And that's not really what I'm trying to do here. Is not trying to expose anybody. But I found this where he says, it's going to look a little bit weird. I'm just going to have to take screenshots and then put them in place here. But this is the story of our heroin epidemic must be told. And this goes into, the addiction rates and the cause of harm from heroin. And, his comments here contradict what he just said about prescription drugs. And he says, people need to hear more about this and not just slush each other when you hear the word heroin at play. The ignorance is bliss game, because there is a problem and it needs to be dealt with. I'm a recovering addict, and I wish I had more knowledge about it when I was younger, and I never would have had to worry about ruining half of my life. So he's saying that the heroin, because it's illegal, ruined half of his life. But when he talks about the prescription drug Klonopin, he says this is just for people who can't take responsibility for their own actions and blame it on a prescription drug. Well, to me, it looks like he's blaming half of his life on an illegal drug. But if you look at these doctors, they say that it's indistinguishable. They're the same thing. You look at insane drug use statistics and the danger of polypharmacy. He said there's no doubt that the U.S. has been manipulated into a nation of drug users. In just a 10-year span from 1992 to 2002, the number of prescriptions written increased a whopping 61%. And in that same period, the number of prescriptions written for opiates increased by almost 400%. According to the latest statistics from the Kaiser Health Foundation, the average American aged 19 to 64 now takes 11 prescription drugs. This brings up another problem which exponentially increased health risks in mixing multiple drugs. The word polypharmacy means many drugs and essentially refers to instances where individuals take too many drugs, either because more drugs are prescribed than clinically indicated or when a sheer number of pills simply becomes a burden of the patient. The situation has been primarily concerned for elderly who generally take more medicines than younger folks. Let's see. And it goes into the, let's see. When treatment is worse than the original problem. Sadly, there are literally millions of people who, like Stevie Nicks, suffer from ravaging side effects of the drugs they didn't need in the first place. Drugs that were supposed to help them in some way, but in reality cause problems far worse than the original concern. For example, knowing how hard it can be to quit drugs like heroin, it's shocking to hear Nick's description of the ordeal in detoxing from Klonopin, or an anti-anxiety medication. She says, I went 47 days and it made Betty Ford look like cakewalk. My hair turned gray, my skin molted, I could hardly walk. You can detox off heroin in 12 days. Coke is just a mental detox, but tranquilizers, they're dangerous. I was terrified to leave, and I came away knowing that that would never happen to me again. And then, here we go. This is the one that I wanted to read. Prescription drugs cause more deaths than illegal drugs. In addition to exorbitant healthcare costs for drugs and their subsequent side effects, the cost of, in terms of lives, has also skyrocketed. Opiate painkillers alone, opiate-like drugs include morphine and codeine, now claim more than 13,800 lives each year. This means prescription painkillers have surpassed both heroin and cocaine as the leading cause of fatal overdoses, despite the fact the FDA increased the restrictions on consumer drug ads in 2005, especially for COX-2 painkillers like Celebrex and Bactra. Additionally, more than 700,000 people visit U.S. emergency rooms each year as a result of adverse drug reactions. And according to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, adverse drug reactions from drugs that are properly prescribed and properly administered cause about 106,000 deaths per year, making prescription drugs the fourth leading cause of death in the USA. When you compare these statistics from the death toll of illegal drugs, which is about 10,000 per year, you begin to see the magnitude of the problem the pharmaceutical industry is propagating. So prescription drugs cause 10 times more deaths than illegal drugs do. So that brings me back to this conversation where, I say, I actually, point out to him that these drugs actually scientifically change your chemistry. So I said, scientifically, these drugs change your chemistry. Take the singer, for example, Stevie Nicks, whose personality has been public and on display her entire life. For the 8 years she was on the prescription Klonopin, she was a mess. She is now off the medication and is making music again. She didn't do, quote, stupid things per se. She simply couldn't function like a normal human being. That isn't to say that people don't do stupid things while on prescriptions. It's a scientific fact that people are more likely to commit homicide or suicide when on SSRI drugs like Prozac. The evidence of that couldn't be more clear with all of these mass killings in the U.S. in the last 20 years. 90% of these homicidal maniacs were on SSRI drugs when they killed. It's not just an illusion. These drugs are causing massive damage. It's a scientific fact. Like my mom, when she was taking these drugs, her bipolar symptoms are extremely obvious and pronounced. When she is off the drugs, she is much more balanced. I have watched her on and off these drugs my entire life, and as a side effect, when I was a teenager, she insisted that I be on these drugs. Justin, who is my youngest brother who killed himself, was taking Zoloft and an anti-anxiety drug before he killed himself. He was only on those drugs about 6 weeks when he took his own life. Same with me. When my mom got me on that shit when I was 17, I attempted to kill myself. I've never tried again since being off those drugs. And I said, now let's talk about Brad. He's not only on Klonopin he was not on Klonopin until Justin died. However, the day that Justin died, my mom ordered him to the doctor for a script for anxiety. They gave him Klonopin. Before the drugs, he had a social life. He had a job. He was a normal functioning adult. After the drugs, he stopped taking care of himself, let his teeth fall apart, and stopped working, stopped dating, and just held up for a long period of time at my mother's house without leaving. So I'm going to block out these names here, but that's just the reality of it, And when I went over to this guy's profile, I wrote him and I said this, and this is going to be my final point here. I'll just leave some links at the bottom in the description in case you're interested. And I said, but you just posted on my wall that drugs aren't a big deal. I don't get what you're saying here. If drugs aren't a big deal, then why do people claim to be an addict? I've never been addicted to anything in my life. I don't smoke tobacco, quit cold turkey, and never went back after smoking since the age of 12. I quit when I was 19 and never looked back. My dad drank like a fish, claimed to be an alcoholic, but I drank like a fish and never had a problem with it. I drink maybe 12 back a year, which is spread out throughout the whole year. But when I was a teen, I used to drink a 12-pack in one sitting. When you posted this on my wall about Klonopin, I was wondering if you had some inside knowledge about this when you said, quote, this is just for people who can't take responsibility for their own actions and blame it on a prescription drug that's really not that big of a deal. Take some responsibility, people, for the stupid things you do and don't blame them on the things you take. So that's why I did this. That's just stupid. And I said, it goes both ways. Such and such. Just because one drug is legal and the other drug is not legal doesn't mean that one is safer than the other. I'm glad that you were clean, but just because I have never known what addiction is doesn't mean that I wouldn't say, quote, addiction doesn't exist, unquote. I just have very little knowledge of what it's like other than what I have saw in other people. I used all kinds of shit too, experimenting with it when I was a teen. I wrote about it, and I wrote the same kind of thing that you wrote on my wall tonight. I took responsibility for all my own actions. I never blamed a drug, but drugs do affect many people, and often very severely. Ref, this is my story, reference to my story that I wrote back in 2001, not 2011, sorry, that was 2001. And I'll link that and stuff, but that's the point here, is people take these prescription drugs as if though they're not that bad because doctors prescribe them, and the illegal stuff is like, worse. But 10,000 people a year die off of illegal drugs. 106,000 people overdose and die off of legal drugs. That's the major issue here. Anyway, check out the links in the bottom.